Welcome to the Manitoba Grazing Clubs, virtually this time. I know the last time you were here, it's about 3 years ago. We had you in the province. We did three great workshops, and that was way back in 3 BC. I kind of talk that way now, before COVID. And we had a great response from producers, so we thought, let's catch up and what's new, what's exciting, what's happening in kind of cows and grazing and food and climate and carbon and all that good stuff. And Dr. Rowntree's professor of animal science, Michigan State University, busy with a whole bunch of things, livestock grazing research, and talking about carbon and all that. And we'll try to touch on some of that today. If you have a question, please type it in the chat, and I'll try to stop at a few points and just ask questions as we go. I'm going to post this on YouTube, Manitoba Grazing Club's YouTube channel, so it'll be there for everyone to take a look at again and review. So just to sort of set the context, we have producers from across Manitoba, Saskatchewan. There's a lot of interest in the potential of improved grazing, to improve soil, forage production, resilience, profitability, all that good stuff.
You bet.
So yeah, as a goal, let's try to give producers some new useful info and understanding that can make their farms healthier. When I think of that, I think like ecologically healthier, financially healthier, happier. We maybe talk about some of what I think you're going to be up to at the new center for regenerative ag, mental health, all that, and more productive. So with that, maybe let's just start with the new Center for Regenerative Agriculture.
You bet. Yeah. So thanks. I enjoy working with you guys, and good morning to everybody. It isn't minus 31 or whatever, thankfully, here. It's we are expecting over a foot of snow. So I'm going to talk a little bit. It may not be, I hope it's all right, but just some things that are on my radar first, and then we can talk about some other stuff. But I want to, I've been working a lot on the aspect of understanding metrics and being able to measure ecological change. And I know, Michael, your work potentially with understanding ag, there's some new things coming out in that space. And so I thought just to and this leads into this new center and a new $19 million project measuring energy, carbon, and water that we have funded simultaneously to kind of launch what we're doing. But to do that, I'll take a quick step back. And in about 2014, I want to say, or 15, I started working with the Savory Institute on the Ecological Outcome Verification. EOV is what it's called. And I had a postdoc from China, actually, a great soil scientist that kind of helped put some things together. But we worked with Pablo Borelli down in Argentina and put this together. And what we try to do is we try to go on farms and ranches and understand how the ecosystem processes are functioning, right? Like, how's your water cycle, your community dynamics, soil health in general, nutrient cycle, energy, et cetera, are moving. And went all over the world. I worked in Africa on this, worked a lot with the Europeans, Australia. We've actually got this approach going over 2 million acres throughout the world now, except in Antarctica. And what's evolving is that there is simultaneously a push to market products from these potentially regenerative ranches and farms. You can see these like Epic, which is a subsidiary of General Mills, Applegate, Hormel, UGG, and Timberland. You go down White Oak Pastures. I was actually working at Will's last week, Michael. Had a great week. And Thousand Hills, many of these farms. And And went, here's Michaela Mick Pretorius in South Africa, and she's one of the young ladies I went with some team here to help train. And just in their local context, they've got over 35,000 hectares that she's now assessing. And so about that time, probably 15, 16, 17, as I really tried to put more effort on what does this aspect look like for soil carbon. And I mean, soil carbon is this hot topic, right? And it's what everybody's talking about to change and pivot and get more regeneration on the landscape with carbon trading, et cetera. And so we started measuring carbon at our farm in 2010, and been monitoring it. And the longer I've done that, the more I realized how hard it is to measure accurately in time and space. And the things that are challenging about it is the fact that it can be highly variable. When you look at different landscapes, it's tough. It varies. And then because of that, it requires potentially hundreds of cores in a landscape to accurately assess what soil carbon might look like. We express soil carbon in a density, like a gram per centimeter cubed. So picture the weight of a sugar cube, right? And we take that weight, we multiply it by the percent carbon, and we go a hectare square and potentially 30 centimeters to a meter deep. So a slight error up front on a gram per centimeter cube basis can be extrapolated across a long or large area on a ranch scape. So it's challenging. And then finally, the existing modeling we have today has been good, but really pretty empirical in its nature. It takes a few variables and basically kind of keeps everything at a mean of around 0.1 tons per hectare annually, something like that, right? So they aren't very accurate, and they don't really hit the highs and lows of what producers are doing in the realm of carbon. And so simultaneously, right now, we have this massive carbon trading push that's going on. I assume you guys are probably hearing or seeing things in Canada. And I spent a lot of time last few years thinking about these aspects. People like Abe Collins has helped me learn. I've learned a lot from Abe and others. And the Natural Capital Project is actually at Stanford University as well as University of Minnesota. And I go back to what they put together because it really helps me understand what is it going to take to pay producers for carbon. Number one, we have to have the desired effect in a carbon market or natural capital market. It could be water, it could be biodiversity, it could be carbon, it could be energy. And so, Michael, if I'm going to pay you for sequestering a ton of carbon, you actually have to do that. It can't be a high five, yeah, I'm going to do it, and we don't measure it. It can't be like just using an empirical model that may not be very accurate. So ultimately, it's going to require a tremendous amount of accuracy, and I would argue also precision to, sorry with the dogs, accuracy and precision to measure it. We're going to have some third party verify it. Then we simultaneously have to consider these aspects of permanence. How long will that carbon be there? There is this concept of additionality in the discussion that says, well, why are we paying people to potentially do something that may already be happening? And then finally, this aspect of saturation that, well, yeah, you can build this carbon, but you know what's going to happen? It's going to saturate in the like a water soaked sponge and be done. The second thing about it too, then, is that there has to be a felt need among buyers and sellers. That, Michael, if you and I, if you're the farmer and I'm the industry entity, that we both have to have a felt need to build that carbon to be more resilient, to lower atmospheric CO2, et cetera. And what I would like to say is right now, there's a huge disconnect, I believe, between urban and rural, as well as our government on, where we are, right? Like most of the farmers I work with day in and day out are just wanting to get to next year, and they're struggling financially. There's a lot of challenges. I don't know if you guys saw it, but there's just a really poorly done piece on New York Times that literally, I believe, threw all of agriculture under a bus. And that's a challenge, right? And so I'm not sure there is a felt need amongst rural and urban, et cetera, yet. And then finally, and probably as much and most importantly, is this premium has to greatly surpass the opportunity cost of paying folks to build carbon. And the effective aspect of it is that we've been, the market's been earning around $15 for carbon. But at $80, $90 oil, where we are today, 88, maybe I saw this morning, that's $400 to $500 a ton in carbon to an oil company to extract. So effectively, we're paying a farmer $15 to put it down, and we're paying an oil company $400 to $500 to extract it. Who's going to win that battle, right? Supply and demand dynamics enter into it. And then finally, really a big fear I've got is, just like everything, somehow, if there is perhaps a more robust carbon market at some point, I've read that people might have indicated up $300 within 10 years, that somehow rural America is still going to get screwed. Okay. And that money's going to leave. It's going to end up in our economic centers. It isn't going to stay at the rural landscape. I think in the US today, a farmer gets 14 to 15 cents of every dollar in our food system. And so,
And
what we ended up doing,
can we pause there for a sec?
Go ahead, dude. No worries.
Yeah, sorry. That was good stuff. And I think there's probably bunch of questions. I haven't seen anything yet, so just reminder that
no worries.
If you have a question,
go ahead.
Just type it in the chat. And here's how I kind of think about it, Jason, is if you think about the health of the farm, a healthy farm financially has good cash flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it also the case that then sort of ecologically, a healthy farm has good carbon flow? And this notion of trying to just put it in the bank, right? The sequestration idea probably doesn't really get at the full understanding of carbon.
Absolutely. You bet. Absolutely. And what has to evolve is we have to have more holistic metrics.
Right.
And that's what we built, like with our EOV, for instance, because it's a 16-point indicator, right? And I believe, I don't know as much about the new understanding ag metric, but I assume it's a similar approach. And I think what happens in society is we, Homo sapiens, still tend to want to simplify things in a way that is just doesn't reflect the complexity of the whole we're managing, right? So, if it's diet, we just talk about a calorie, or if it's a human health, we talk about, body mass index, and these simplified metrics. Whoever deemed CO2 equivalent to be the judge of the worth of society from an environmental perspective, that's just a silly notion, right?
Right.
And so our hope would be long term. That's really kind of what we're hoping to do with our project, is to expand from that, right? To try to more aptly understand what's happening, not only with carbon, but with energy capture, photosynthesis, and especially water cycling and function.
Yeah, we talk about carbon cycle, energy cycle, mineral cycle, but then suddenly when it comes to talking about a carbon market, that the cycle part of it disappears, and it's just let's pump it in the soil, which of course there is some of that going on too. But anyways, the point is that it's complex, like you're saying. And then the other side of it, when money gets involved, is games will get played.
Yeah, I've been aware of. I mean, I've heard that companies right now are trying to sign up farmers for 90+ year carbon contracts
Yeah.
right now.
It's,
So it kind of reminds me of maybe like the 20s and 30s with the oil and mineral rights, right? Where,
right.
oh yeah, I can make a few extra bucks. And then next thing you know, you've signed potentially tens of millions of dollars away, for instance.
Yeah. What is interesting is as part of some of the work I'm doing with this regenerative project up in Canada with General Mills and Understanding Ag is we are looking at carbon and but trying to build a program that will be good for the farmer. So that's something that at least hopefully something can come out of this where the farmer's rewarded and is incentivized if they can do better management to then see more carbon sequestered, they'll be rewarded for that. Then of course the value of that, I think they're still using the number you're using, 15 a ton. So whatever, it's a place to start. But what we're trying to do is design something that will be good for the farmer first, and then not just that's going to make someone a lot of money on a carbon exchange, which those things seem to have all kind of blowing up, falling apart.
No, absolutely. And so like, I'll switch gears for a minute, bro.
Okay.
And if you don't mind, is there any other questions before I go on? I think Steve said he's got one.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. Hi, Jason. I'm frustrated, I guess, a little bit with the carbon talk in industry right now, ag business and farmer producer groups as well. They're all trying to look good,
Absolutely.
but they're not actually doing anything that's useful. I mean, I'm looking at net carbon, right? If you've got you're going to reduce the amount of chemicals you're going to use by 30%, right? That's one of the goals that I've heard people say. Well, if you reduce chemical use by 30%, your alternative is going to be tillage, right? Mm-hmm. So net carbon is going to be more emitting. And how do we get that? Like, how do we push that so everybody's not just looking good? How do we make it so they're actually sequestering more than they're emitting? Because we're the only industry on the planet that has the ability to be, go beyond carbon neutral, but we're not by far.
Absolutely great comment. And so like I could go into greenhouse gas accounting a lot, but it has to evolve past the simplified metric, number one, right? Like that we need better we need better indicators. And so I'll just tell a story, right? Like I think right now ag, in my career, and see, here's the deal. I try not to ever make this a black and white or a left versus right. I mean, there's been enough flipping polarization, and I constantly believe that everybody's on a gradient of regeneration potentially, right? Like if this concept of either is or you ain't isn't going to get us very far. And I think what's happened now is I work with big industry, I work with small industry, kind of like Michael a lot, and the problem is that the lack of education, I think, agriculturally on what it really takes to do these things, to your point, right, is we just haven't near met it. And so I think you have well-intentioned individuals that are saying we can do these things, we're going to do these things because they have pride in what they do and they consider themselves stewards. But unfortunately, the practices don't reflect what regenerative outcomes. And so I think that's the real logjam, is that education piece on understanding. And so like I said, I try not to ever get polarizing, and I see big entities wanting to do that. So I just see then that there's a reflexive, with all this heat from the media right now. Yesterday's New York Times piece was one of the worst things I've ever seen, frankly. And so it's a reflexive fight, right? You're attacking me, I feel threatened. We can do this stuff. Well, honestly, in carbon, man, it takes a lot to change these things ecologically. You all know that. And so I think where we have to do moving forward is the kind of work that like Michael's doing with General Mills, et cetera, where we're really trying to educate, to implement practices and principles, most specifically principles that can give regenerative outcomes.
Yeah, thank you very much. It just doing one little thing and then calling yourself regenerative, and they actually believe that they are doing it, but they don't
Yeah.
understand the carbon sequestration at all. And
Right.
I don't know how we get that out there. I just education, like you said, I guess.
Yeah, well, the thing, dude, I'm we have airlines that are going to be carbon neutral by the year 2050, right? And and the fact is even so, I mean, if you're producing a lot of food and you do have a carbon footprint, what's necessarily wrong with that? Interestingly, to your point though, and I'll hush after this, Michael,
Right.
is we did a study. Oh God, it was like 11, 12. So it's been 10 years ago. And just simplify this, we had twice the cattle in a treatment, and we were using those cattle as a kind of a high grazing intensity, using a kind of a MIG, really aggressive. We're going to put all that grass in the cattle. We're not going to leave a lot of litter, etc. And ultimately, the other treatment was more of kind of a mob, right? Like, but I had half the stocking rate. So I had twice the cows, right? Twice the cows. And so we measured all the greenhouse gases fluxing through that system. And so you would hypothetically think the system that would have the greater footprint on a CO2 equivalent would obviously be the system that had twice the cows. Measure methane, guess what? In that system, there's twice the methane. You've got twice the cows. However, for one reason or another, and I don't think it was the system, I think it was the way we measured it, we had about a 15% higher nitrous oxide emission in the less stocked treatment. And because nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 300 approximately, i.e. it's 300 times the radiative forcing effect of CO2, and methane's 25, that nitrous oxide blip at 15% offset all the methane. And the footprint wasn't different in either of those systems just because of a bump in nitrous. So then taking that and understanding that nitrous has a much greater effect on radiative forcing and global warming, let's think about this approach then of we're going to feed the world with plants. Well, in order to do that, you're going to need a lot of nitrogen. And that nitrogen arguably is going to offset any benefits that they think they're gaining in methane.
Yeah. Interesting. That the point is that these are complex systems that are never just one thing. Like, methane, and you've talked about it in some of your webinars, and the life of methane versus CO2, and well, here, quick question about cows on grass versus cows in a feedlot then, and methane is, what about methanotropes? These supposedly methane consuming bacteria that are present on a pasture that could, that are consuming methane, that have evolved with grazing animals over, thousands of years, that are doing that job versus, cows on corn and soybean in a feedlot. It's not to say one is good or bad, but just to sort of understand the complexity of those systems. It's not just about the burping and the farting. It's where the cow is.
Yeah. In like really, we probably had fairly close to the same amount of ruminants pre-colonial days. Right. Okay. So granted, there's a big difference on where they are. And I don't think that's brought up enough, right? In a Great Plains livestock setting versus quasi confinement, those kind of things, part of it anyway, probably 30% of it. And so, yeah, I mean, we know that with the methane cycle, there is a certain amount that are broken down in the soil by methanotrophs. There's also methanogens in the soil that put it up, and we do see a methane soil methane emission. And interestingly, what is also known is that high nitrogen environments just snuff the life out of methanotrophs. And like in my context in Michigan, all of our grasses are tame, cool seasons that evolved in high nitrogen environments. So they were grown and bred in high nitrogen environments. And therefore, we in our work here, we've seen very little offset, such that the soil methane, the microbes can offset, but as far as enterically, we've not seen that, right? We haven't seen it. But again, I believe it's because of our environment. So if you're in a Great Plains context and you have much lower nitrogen environments, I would hypothesize, obviously, then the methanotroph activity is much greater, i.e. around a termite mound, you see, large methanotroph populations. And I would have to believe that around, cattle and those lower nitrogen environments, you would see the same thing. So in any way, we do again know that it's broken down in the atmosphere in an 8 to 12 year, I think 12 years, somewhere right in there. Yep. And using better modeling, because methane has a different half-life. I mean, there's been work out there recently by the Nature Conservancy that indicates that right now, the way that we measure methane, it's 3 to 4 times higher. The way we measure it, it's probably overestimating the impact on warming by 3 to 4 fold. And actually, if we just reduced enteric methane by 0.35% annually, less than 1%, it's sufficient to stop further increases in global temps due to ag methane emissions. Even further, if we drop it 5%, it would actually offset additional warming caused by methane since the 80s, which effectively would be a cooling event, right? But we don't talk about that in today's society. We just hyper focus on, methane is bad, therefore get rid of methane, and we don't nuance biogenic methane versus methane from other sources.
Well, that's it, versus oil and gas. But what you're saying there with that, say 5% reduction, that's a huge opportunity for agriculture to be part of, the solution. And that's like, I totally agree with what Steve was saying, is there's this incredible opportunity for agriculture to be part of these solutions, whether we're talking climate change or regenerating soil or growing good food, and we can go down any of those paths. But I do have a question here, so I'm going to pivot. You mentioned a New York Times story.
Yeah.
Question was, what was the point, real quick, there of that story?
It had a lot to do with what I would call corporatization of beef. But what they simultaneously do is they lump every farmer into the cog of the machine.
Yeah.
And so basically the entire industry, including all farmers, get thrown under this bus. And it just, so one of those deals where it's probably 70% accurate and the rest is propaganda, but people won't know the difference. And it was probably one of the most condemning things I've seen in agriculture in a long time. They quote 2 colleagues in a non-contextual way on a video clip. And, it was in the opinion part of it, but it's just the fact that I was astounded actually at how bad it was. And, it's becoming a normal. And I just, have to think, like, what is the solution here? Are you just going to starve? Like, if you just like close your eyes and swing uncontrollably at ag, I mean, it's not going to be a good outcome. So the things that we want to do, right? We want to get better. We want to regenerate. We want to improve. Farmers, I think largely people feel threatened by these attacks.
Sure.
And so what then evolves is that there is a double down on, by God, I'm right. And, what's the first rule that Alan Savory teaches in holistic management is to plan like you're wrong. And so it creates this very difficult, this difficult context when you want to, I spent a large majority of my career, for instance, working in perennials. When you look at the whole of Michigan, it's cropland and dairy. And we need to make the impacts there where it counts. My colleague Bruno Basso here, he says that basically 80% of the problems with runoff, sediment, nutrient loss is basically 80% of it's on 20% of the land. Yeah. And he does that through NDVI and other imaging using remote sensing. And if you can, crop stability indices, and if you can rectify that 20%, we're a long way down. But what happens is that people just feel attacked. And I think then they don't want to be receptive to anything.
Yeah, and even if they want to change, they don't necessarily know how to do it or what to do. And so that's where I think let's you use the word regenerative a few times now. Would you, in your words, kind of explain what you mean when you start to talk about regenerative ag and what are the possibilities? Like what you see, and you use the word principles. So what would you mean, if you were to describe
Yeah,
regenerative ag?
and so like, for me, I first think of regeneration as the ability of an ecosystem, in this case the environment, and its living population to recover from damage, right? So the ecological definition of regeneration is what we probably consider resilience.
Right.
It's that ability to snap back. And I tend to use Hannah Gosnell's definition of regenerative ag, where she says that, regenerative ag focuses on enhancing and restoring holistic and resilient systems. And that is supported by functioning ecosystem processes and healthy soils capable of producing a full suite of ecosystem services, among them carbon and improved water retention, for instance. And so, under that auspice, then we know that the key to doing that is photosynthesis and the ability to capture energy in the form of sunlight, to capture carbon dioxide and water. Plants photosynthesize and give away glucose and oxygen. And that has been happening for a very, very long time. And so, what has happened though, then, is that we have gotten away from that aspect of enhancing the resilience in these systems by emphasizing and maximizing efficiency, which is an output per unit input. So we focus on that versus the resilience of the system. And so we know then that through the adoption of soil health principles that you've heard much about, whether it be perennialization in annual systems or covers or biodiversity or getting grazing, back into farming landscapes, among others, all within a given context, is how we get there. And the beauty of principles, right, is that, there are going to be tools in the toolbox of where you live or where you farm that are more conducive to certain principles than others. And it becomes not this like, I have the hammer and everything's a nail. It's a more of a nuanced approach to improving regeneration in a landscape. We do know a few things though, right? And Alan taught me one thing that I've always remembered, is that water begets carbon. And
Mhm.
so this aspect of improved water retention and holding water versus allowing it to leave a micro environment is huge. And by doing that, that tends to obviously then jumpstart that carbon cycle. And so what are the key principles that have to happen to do that? Well, it's keeping your ground covered, right? And and as we do that, we build carbon, we build improved aggregate, which improves pore space, which manifests in greater water retention and holding capacity, and that cycle, in a beautiful, complex, nonlinear way, explodes.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, it's like you're ultimately building this soil carbon sponge, and everything starts to move in a positive direction from
Mhm.
that. Very cool. Maybe that leads us into talking about your new center for regenerative ag.
Yeah, so under that auspice that, it's a challenge, I think, in a way to um, measure this stuff. With the pandemic, I had a lot of time, did a lot of work and research on investigating, and it all happened actually. I was in New York, and there's a group of us, and Will Harris from White Oaks was at the table, and we just got on this discussion about what is carbon worth. And it's like, to his point, it's like, you know what, why is my land that is healthy, it's worth a little bit, but it's really not worth that much more than my neighbors that's fairly extracted, because obviously we go back to NRCS type of metrics of performance of the land, or how much capability it has to produce 150 or 200 bushels of corn. And so I just started with a colleague here in Michigan. We just started really tossing it around, right? Like, what is carbon worth and what is the value of it? And that led me into considering a lot of things, and that's where I kind of came up with the oil analogy, frankly. But having those experiences with EOV and understanding that while it's great to measure ecosystem function, it's not a substitute, or it isn't good enough, in my opinion, to function in a carbon market, right? So then ultimately I started considering, what is it going to take to potentially measure ecological function in a broad landscape? And I had people, for instance, like I mentioned, I always want to give people like Abe Collins a lot of credit for some of the work that I built in here, as well as guys like John Norman, Gabe Brown, and others. But ultimately, we worked on a system that will potentially help us do this at a better spill. And so I was able to write a project up, and we actually just recently got it funded for more than 19 million to do this. And so we've got a list and a broad group of funders on the project. The FFAR, by the way, is the Foundation for the Future of Ag Research, which is an NGO that funds agriculture work out of DC. And so effectively what we're doing, right, is trying to, first of all, effectively take 3 locations in the United States: Michigan, upper Midwest, right? The Western US, Wyoming, Colorado, and then the lower Great Plains. And we are going to intensively instrument those sites. And what I mean by that, we're using eddy covariate flex towers, and these flex towers measure how CO2 is moving in and out of a system. We're also putting in water sensors. We're sampling a lot of soil for what we call the MEMS model out of Colorado State, which to me is the best model I've seen on potentially predicting soil carbon changes over time. But it's driven by organic matter and the different kinds of organic matter in the topsoil, mineral and particulate or associated organic matter. But then importantly, we are creating a gradient of grazing impact on that landscape, highly like what we call adaptive, trying to really build litter, improve nitrogen cycling, improve carbon absorption and carbon building, and then more of a continuous prescriptive kind of approach, perhaps. But then simultaneously, as we're measuring that all on the ground, we're bringing it up to space, which is why I have this slide, right? We're bringing it up to some of the best new sensors on the space station, right? And we're working with Dr. Martha Anderson, who is USDA ARS, and she has worked on what's called the Alexi-Dyslexi model, that's actually measuring evapotranspiration at a 90% correlation to on the ground. And so the equipment we have, we're measuring active radiation, photosynthetic radiation, all these aspects of energy. And then we are measuring evapotranspiration, linking it up to space. So the goal then is, can we create better correlations based on that relationship at minimum with evapotranspiration? And so the goal then is, after 3 years, we're going to get on 60 farms and ranches throughout the United States, and then see how aptly we can begin to scale all this data up into big databases using new predictive algorithms, probably some artificial intelligence type of nuance that I am not above my pay grade, right? And then simultaneously working with these farmers and ranchers, really trying to understand on a social ecological scale what is driving adoption of those soil health principles in a ranch landscape. Interviewing, and so these farmers we're working with, we're measuring on, we're going to be interviewing them, really trying to understand what's going on. So we're not only really trying to measure what's happening ecologically on their farm, but we know what's driving them. And then the goal after that would be to then frame that approach of intense metrics. To me, the best metrics we can use with these drivers on the social ecological side. And so I've kind of frameworked a Center for Regenerative Ag based on those principles, Michael. And so we are going to expand not only into grasslands, but also into cropland systems, measure these things at scale. I'm very interested to see kind of like the Fred Provenza and others work on, can we create bigger databases on understanding what the nutrient density of the foods coming off these different properties look like, what's driving the health of our farmers economically, their well-being, and then trying to improve, prosperity in a community basis. But again, to me, that center core has to be resilience. And I think we get there from a standpoint of adopting these principles of soil health through regenerative ag.
Yep. Absolutely. There's a couple of comments here just about the conversation you were having there about carbon. Was the quote, to get it correct, the quote by Alan Savory was "water begets carbon"?
Oh yeah, that, and don't like quote me,
but no,
I
something
learned
like
that from
that. To
Alan one
that,
day when I got to go visit him, and
yeah,
I've always
yeah.
remembered him saying that. Yeah,
It probably kind of, it's like sort of the two are interconnected, and it kind of goes both ways, right?
Right.
Water
And I
follows
think the
carbon.
driver is that, like, soil's active all the time, but without water, it's sitting there. And
Yeah.
in these arid environments that have wet, dry seasons, if you can't capture that water when you capture it, then for the rest of that year, you're not doing a hell of a lot. I think maybe might be the context, right?
Yep.
But it does make sense to me. So, like, people ask me, what's the first thing I need to do? Well, it behoove one to get their ground covered and capture that water versus seeing it run off.
Yep. Okay, we got about 10 minutes or so left. Maybe we should sort of give a few or talk a little bit about grazing and some maybe what you've been seeing over the last 3 years since you've been here, and some good ideas for improving grazing management to do all that, to improve carbon and water.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've really evolved much in those 3 years, right? I think that we continue to measure carbon at our place, and it continues to seem to improve. But the longer I live, man, the less confident or comfortable I am about saying anything, man. I begin to just learn of this massive complexity, and then to just say, oh, we can, I begin to worry about these aspects of error, and even doing this in a scientific setting, it's hard. And so, to me, then, we've seen it improve, but then I begin to worry about, well, are we mismeasuring it? Are we not accounting for the overall variation? We've been managing the same way, really, where we're down to like 1-day moves typically in our context. This last year we grazed about 210 days, I believe, on 570 grazable acres with probably about a couple hundred animal units, maybe 220 was our performance this year. I think that equated we didn't even have that many stock days per acre this year because we did a lot of haying. We didn't grass finish as much this year because of our other research. And so we probably were still about 80 to 90 cow days an acre. And we did put up about 160 tons of hay off our place, which we haven't done in years, but we were just worried about what was happening with the pandemic and all the economy things. And we figured we might as well have a barn full of hay from our place just as a safety mechanism. So I think we did a pretty good job, but we're just really trying to graze to recovery. And in our context here, that's normally about a 60-day return. So across our farm, it probably gets grazed about 1.5 to 1.75 times annually. So there's probably, 15, 20% of the place, maybe less, 10, I don't know, somewhere in there that doesn't get grazed but once. And the other thing is, like, what we've really just kind of set into, Michael, is that, these concepts of like grow fast, move fast, et cetera, with the fact we get so much snow, and generally coming into December, we're done, we've just slowed down. We haven't really sped up or tried to match the growth pattern of the grass and have a 15 or 20-day return, followed by a 40-day return, followed by a 60-day return. We just focus on grass utilization and litter. In the early season, we can't get much litter just because those grasses are so pliant. They don't have a lot of cellulose in their stems. We tend to probably run more through the cow at that early point. And then as we get more growth approaching like the summer equinox or the, whatever the, end of June, we'll begin to have a little more fiber. We can begin to trample more. By August, September, we're doing a lot more trample. And so that is kind of our approach. We, from a pasture management perspective, I see the question from Larry,
Yep.
that, these aspects of climate, I don't know. But I had an interesting chat the other day that, like with a group that they were actually seeing in long-term studies improved carbon in the top 30 centimeters. But when they began to get deeper, and this in a mollisol soil, Michael, do y'all have a lot of mollisols there?
Honestly, I'm not sure.
Okay. This would be like a soil like at Gabe's, like that really deep topsoil.
Yeah, we have nice, rich prairie soils for the most part across Manitoba, Saskatchewan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trinosomes would probably be more,
yeah.
Well, we got some black
saying,
and some black and brown soils. Yeah.
They're actually seeing some carbon losses in the short term at deeper rates. And what they blamed that on was the aspects of climate and more warming and less freezing and less cold and less depth of frost. So ultimately, that deeper soil was burning more CO2 off, which in the meter basis was actually then they weren't seeing any change at all because certain areas were building and other areas were newly discovered. And they kind of call that concept priming. And I don't know what to think about it because, my small mind, I start thinking about, grassroots getting deeper, more carbon, building below.
Right.
But the fact is in these windows of more warmth, they're seeing more CO2 burned off, more metabolism and respiration in those systems. So if you aren't putting back a volume of litter, your carbon actually may be going backwards potentially.
Interesting. So when you talk about the differences between, say, there are some differences between us and where you are is maybe thinking more about principles then, if you were to give some advice there for grazing principles for us here that you would recommend. Like you mentioned one, like keep the ground covered, soil armor. That would be...
How much grass do y'all grow? Like on an average place, what is your tonnage annually?
Well, like an average hay field would yield, say, 3 bale an acre, kind of, long term.
So 2 tons, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Mostly cool season glasses, or where you get a lot of warm seasons?
No, mainly cool, but yeah, we get.
Yeah,
mainly cool.
Again, I think the number one thing is to graze to recovery. And one thing that we do that I like in our EOV is we actually have species we identify as preferable or sought after or whatever,
Yep.
And you want those species maybe represent higher trophic cascade grasses and grazing in a way that allows those to enter into the system greater. For us, like, it might be having a lot of trefoil in a warm season context, maybe big blue or Indian grass, and so grazing, I think then that grazing recovery is a big component of that, and ensuring that you're not overgrazing. And overgrazing again is when the plant isn't fully recovered from the prior grazing. And normally we find that is going from stage 2, stage 3, kind of going into that vegetated to reproductive is when that occurs, right? You start to see seed heads begin to come out of the sheath again, and the grasses begin to try to put up a seed head. That's kind of our idea of recovery. And and so that's just kind of, we haven't changed a lot there. And so I think that's an important component. And so understanding what that recovery is in our context here, again, we think it's about 60 days. Well, then that kind of creates our opportunity of assigning how much density and how much space we give daily to make that recovery. And as I indicated, we normally go slower, so it's not a problem. And we typically have more grass than we know what to do with. And we've been up to 300 units on the farm, and that pushes it pretty hard. Again, on that, 570 acres, we can do it. But I don't know if we're building a lot of carbon in doing that. We're probably running as much energy then back through the cow or yearling.
One of the things we've been seeing is as we improve our grazing and we're maybe getting a little more soil health, the biology is functioning, and all that good stuff, that the normal kind of understanding that the good stuff is that green lush grass, very vegetative, right? That's the good stuff. It is maybe not the case, and then we're finding that almost like mid-maturity can be the real rocket fuel, because you have a better balance of protein and energy. And that's of course not the case, in maybe kind of like your typical sort of overgraze scenario where, you'd think that's hardly even worth making hay out of. But we're sort of finding that. And then we're even things like smooth brome. I don't know if you're familiar with smooth brome, which isn't, necessarily
Sure,
a great grazing.
you bet.
We're seeing like almost mature brome with Brix measurement of high 20s or 30, which is sort of just unheard of. And I think that's just a function of the good management over time. That whole system's just rocking and rolling.
Yeah, I agree. Well, bro, I hate to be short, but I'm gonna have to roll.
Yeah, well, no, thank you very much. One last question. If you'd recommend one person that we could think that you could maybe make an introduction for us to have another webinar with, who would that be? Someone kind of new that I maybe wouldn't be familiar with, that would be good to talk with.
Let me think, and I'll send you a note.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Jason. Well,
good to see everybody.
Yeah.
Or here. Yeah.
All right. Have a good day.
Bye, guys.
See ya.